So God told him to work it and to keep this garden. See, work is a God-given assignment and not a cursed condition. I know work is a 4-letter word. I understand that. It's a 4-letter word. But when you think about it, it is a God-given assignment. People say, well, chapter 3, man falls and the ground is cursed, but work itself is not cursed. The ground is cursed. Somehow we get in our mind that work is a bad thing and we shouldn't even ask people to work because it's bad to ask them to work. No, it's a God-given assignment for us to work. In fact, Westerman said, life without work would not be worthy of human beings. We are designed to tend, to keep this garden, this God has given to us. And this word translated work, it's a common one for tilling or working or cultivating the garden. His job was to cultivate the garden. We get our word culture from that. Adam and Eve's job in the garden was to create a culture in which God was worshiped, loved, and feared in this place that was like a temple, like a tabernacle, their offering of sacrifices to Him, of their obedience to Him. That was their role in this garden, to work it, to make a culture in which God is worshiped, loved, and feared. We are to be ministers of this created order that He has given, attending to it as He wills. Work is certainly intrinsic to part of that tending and working this creation. Gordon Wenham wrote, "It should be noted that even before the fall, man was expected to work. Paradise was not a life of leisured unemployment." Work is who we are. We are to take God's creation and we are to work it and to tend it, to cultivate a culture in which God is worshiped, loved, and feared. That is God's desire in the garden. That is His desire still for mankind. So man's work was to improve his surroundings, work the garden, and to protect from waste or loss, to tend it, to guard it, to keep the garden. So man's work in the garden, as he was doing what God asked him to do, man's work in the garden was his service as if he was a priest in the temple offering up sacrifices to God. And what was his sacrifice? Obedience. Obedience is an act of worship. Every time you obey God from His word, when He tells us something to do or not to do, every time you obey it is an act of worship to God. You are worshiping God by your obedience. The author Dorothy Sayers wrote, "Work is not primarily a thing one does to live, but the thing one lives to do. It is, or should be, the full expression of the worker's faculties, the thing in which he finds spiritual, mental, and bodily satisfaction, and the medium in which he offers himself to God." And I can hear your brains churning right now and saying, that's not my workplace. That's not my workplace. But that's what was intended. That's what was desired by God. That's how it should be. And He's also not to work it only, but He's also to keep it. It actually means to guard it, not let harm come to the garden. He's to tend it. He's to guard it. And that word is actually used for responsibility in religious duties in Leviticus 18:4. "You shall follow my rules and keep," there's the word, "and keep my statutes and walk in them." So it has the idea of observing religious commands, this word keep. Again, we're back to this idea of a tabernacle, temple-like presence in which man is worshiping God through his obedience to Him. I am the Lord your God. And then the Hebrew behind this word keep has the idea of protecting from harm. Is not to let harm, when you think, well, there's no sin in the garden right now. What kind of harm could come to the garden? Well, His goal was to keep harm from coming. And he and Eve failed miserably in chapter 3 because they let harm come to the garden. His job was to work it and to guard it, to tend it, to keep it, to protect from harm. So anything that would restrict the worship of God in His tabernacle-like garden, He has to stop that. He cannot let that happen. Man could let nothing get in between his obedience and working and keeping the garden, which was his act of worship, and the Creator. And he zealously guards anything that gets in the way of proper worship. He's to tend it. He's to work it. He's to keep it. He's to work it. He's to guard it. So the word work, we talked about cultivating, tilling, is also used in other places in the Old Testament for the word service. The word service. Look in Exodus 3:12. It's used in worship in a religious sense of serving God. He said, but I will be with you. He's talking to Moses. But I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. That's the word we're looking at right now. It has a religious undertone. It's to minister to God, to serve God on this mountain. So to work is to serve God is the idea. So work from the root meaning to serve, and keep meaning to look after or have charge over. And both of these terms are wrapped up together describing the Levitical priest in the temple or tabernacle. The same exact words are used for them. It gives us this religious undertone, this idea again of the garden being of a tabernacle-like place where where man offers up his worship to God by his obedience. Obedience is an act of worship. It's found in Numbers chapter 3, in 7 and 8. In both 7 and 8, we see the words multiple times used. They shall keep guard, there's a word right there, keep, over him and over the whole congregation before the tent of meeting as they minister. There's the word work, serve at the tabernacle. They shall guard, there's a word again, all the furnishings of the temple, of the tent of the meeting, and keep, there's a word again, keep guard over the people of Israel as they minister at the tabernacle. Again, these two words are used in reference to religious duties, so we get this picture of the garden being a tabernacle-like structure in which man offers up his obedience to God as his act of worship. Martin Luther likened the tree to Adam's church, altar, and pulpit. Here he was to yield to God the obedience he owed, give recognition to the word and will of God, give thanks to God, and call upon God for aid against temptation. The garden was like a tabernacle. No physical structure there, I understand that, but it was like a tabernacle. All of the words that are used are very similar to religious words that we see in other places in the Old Testament. By working and keeping the garden, man was offering up sacrifices to God. His obedience is an act of worship. Remember, when all is said and done, and we get to the new heaven and the new earth in the book of the Revelation, I want you to see something. There's a new garden there. The garden is there again. It's like the garden once more. But Revelation chapter 21, verse 22, what do we see? And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. Again, no physical structure in this new garden, in the new heaven and the new earth. But again, it gives the picture of Eden being like a place of worship, like a tabernacle or a temple. We have an obligation to our Creator to cultivate His creation according to His expressed will, to cultivate the idea of bringing into a culture the idea of God being worshiped and loved and feared. And creating a culture in which God is worshiped, loved, and feared is our goal. It was the goal of Adam and Eve. It's our goal to today. Yes, it's much harder today than there. And only believers can cultivate this kind of place. An unbeliever doesn't care about worshiping God. An unbeliever doesn't care about loving God. An unbeliever doesn't care about having a reverence for God, a fear for God. It's up to us to create this culture. It's not going to be done by the unbeliever. The unbeliever doesn't care at all. You and I have to be the ones to create this culture in which God is worshiped, loved, and feared. It'll never fall into the hands of the unbeliever. They will not care. They cannot build a culture for God. So the duty to fulfill the Creator's desire for tending and working His world falls on us as believers. It is our responsibility to do that. The garden that man was placed into, that he was to work it, he was to minister, serve, he was to keep it, he was to guard from bringing in harm. That was his sphere of influence. So when God said to Adam and Eve, this is your sphere of influence, this garden right here, I want you to work it. I want you to keep it. I want you to create a culture in which I am worshiped and loved and feared. That is your role, Adam and Eve. And of course, if they wouldn't have sinned, all the successive generations coming from Adam and Eve would have had this same culture, the idea that God is worshiped and loved and feared. That was his sphere of influence, was the garden.